Now we're going to talk about what is seller financing. Well, seller financing is actually any time you buy a house, take title to the house, and you still owe the seller money. That's seller financing. Now that could be in multiple different types. For example, I could be making them a payment for years, or I could just have one big old balloon payment due later off, or I can make them no payments at all, but it's all seller financing. Again, anytime I owe the seller money after I purchase the property, in other words, if the seller has not been cashed out, then it's seller financing. Seller financing comes in two different types, really. There are free and clear houses, and then there are houses that have a mortgage on them. All right, you're going to run across both. And there's about a third of the houses in the country are free and clear. So if the seller decides to take a monthly payment for all or part of their equity, that's seller financing. If the house has a mortgage on it, and I start making the seller a payment, they're going to take my payment and make their underlying payment and keep the difference if there is any. That's seller financing. If the seller has a mortgage on it and I simply agree to make their payment and I owe them nothing, well, in the case of a wraparound mortgage, I'll owe them, but I owe them the same amount that they owe underlying. And I might even pay the bank direct, but that's seller financing. So the seller's still in it. Now, one that isn't seller financing is subject to, and I'm coming back to that, but when the seller just deeds me the house and walks away, they're not financing anything. I'm just taking over the existing debt that they already created on their house, and I'm just agreeing to make payments to their bank. I'll come back to that shortly, because you must understand what subject to means, and you must understand what a wraparound mortgage means. All right, with owner financing, here's an example, very simple example. It's a $200,000 house. And the seller calls you, and they are asking 185 or 195, really doesn't make what they're asking. You finally agree that you would pay them 185. Now let's stop right there for a minute. See, their house is only worth 200, and I'm giving them $185,000. So we're not in the business of stealing houses. That's very little equity. That's less than they'd pay a realtor, or about the same as they'd pay a realtor if the realtor sold a house for them. That's not a big ask on our part. So the seller's given up a little bit of equity, which they would probably give up anyway, because if I buy this house, I'm going to pay their closing costs because they're getting very little down, as you'll notice, $5,000 down. So if I pay closing costs, depending on what state I'm in, that's probably several $1,000s right there I got to chip in, as well as the down payment. So the seller is really getting a good deal here. They got no commission to pay. All they do is give up a little bit of equity, and they get their house sold. And in this case, they get a down payment. This house is free and clear, so they get $5,000 down. Many of the deals we negotiate are zero down. And they get $800 a month. And we ask them to wait 3 months before we start making the payment, which is something that I always get. I don't ask, I get it every single time. I want several months to go by before I start making payments. It's a condition of my offer. It's not something we're going to negotiate much. All right, so what's my exit? Simply, I put it on the market for $210. Remember now, this house is in good shape. This house don't need any work. We're not a rehab business. This is a nice house in a nice area, not a war zone house in a crack area. This is the kind of house people really want to live in. And we don't have to do anything to it. And that means that we can immediately put it on the market as soon as we get it purchased. And in fact, if it's vacant, we'll probably put it on the market before we even buy it. So we put it out there for $210, and I always sell it for more than what it's worth when I'm selling it with terms. Because my terms are, I'll lease option it to a tenant buyer who gives me $15,000 non-refundable option deposit and agrees to pay me $1,500 a month rent. So in a nutshell, I'm ahead. If I collect 15 and I paid 5, I'm ahead $10,000 up front, less closing costs. Look at my monthly spread. I got a $700 monthly spread, meaning the difference between the rent I'm collecting and the payment I'm making is $700 a month. And my friend, as far as I'm concerned, that's the most important number on that page for you right there. Because your objective should be to get that monthly spread up beyond where you're at and where you need to make a living. And if you do, you're financially free. This monthly spread is going to come in every single month, whether you're working or not working, or in Tahiti, or even still on the earth. So your goal is to build that cash flow up and build it up as fast as you can. And look at a little old $200,000 house I got a $700 monthly spread on. I got a little bit of money coming on the back end when they cash me out. And so, you know, all of these advantages. I'm going to come back and go over all the advantages of doing this here in a little bit. But just with that one deal, one little simple owner financing deal, and you can see where the owner financing comes in. I'm going to continue paying the seller for some term, which I haven't discussed on here really, but we will probably agree upon some term before the loan is due, or sometimes not. Sometimes we get long-term financing and we just keep on letting this golden goose live. And every month my payment, my principal amount goes down, and every month my lease option tenant buyer's amount is fixed. When I put a tenant buyer in a house, it's fixed. They do not get credit for any part of the payment or rent credit. So every month my spread gets larger. I owe less, they still owe me the same. And so you can getting to see why these owner financing deals are really, we call them the golden geese, because they just keep on laying golden eggs. All right, this next section is the tools for owner financing. Now, here's some good news. Good news is you are never going to fill out any of these tools. These are things for lawyers to fill out, your closing attorney to fill out, your closing agent to fill out. But there's 3 different devices that are used with owner financing. And I don't care what state you're in. In fact, all 3 of them will depend on what state you're in. I'm in Florida. I'm in a mortgage state. In Florida, if I owe the seller money and they have an underlying debt, then my loan will wrap around their loan. The attorney will create a new note mortgage that wraps around their underlying debt. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Call that a wraparound mortgage. So if I buy a property in Florida, that's usually the one I'm going to use about 75% of the time. The other 25%, I'll give the seller a first mortgage because there is no underlying debt for my loan to wrap around. And then opposite of that is a deed of trust. If you're in a deed of trust state, then you don't have mortgages, you have deeds of trust. But the same thing is fact. You'll have a wraparound deed of trust, which is technically a AITD, which is an all-inclusive trust deed. They call them wraparound deeds of trust, like Texas and Georgia and California, and I mean there's a lot of states. I don't even know the number, but probably half are deed of trust and half are mortgage states. And again, you're not ever going to create one of these documents. Your job is only to plug in the numbers so the attorney can create them, the payment, the term, the interest rate, and all of that. And then there's that middle one to further confuse you. It's called a land contract most commonly, but it can be called a land contract, a contract for deed, an agreement for deed, a land installment contract, bond for deed. All of those titles are relevant to the state that you're in, and that's all. They're all the same type of an agreement, but it seems like every state's got a different title for them. So when you hear the word land contract, to me in Florida, it's an agreement for deed. In Texas, it's a contract for deed, and so forth and so on. In Louisiana, it's a bond for deed. All the same thing. And here's what that means. It means that there's an agreement between the seller and the buyer, that the buyer will make payments to the seller for an agreed upon amount of time, and when those payments are paid in full, the seller will then deed the property to the buyer. Now that sounds like a lease option, but it is not. A land contract is a sale. It's a legitimate legal sale of the property, even though the deed stays in the seller's name. It's a legal sale, and as far as the IRS is concerned, it's a sale. The buyer has all the rights of ownership, same as if they bought on a wraparound mortgage or paid cash for the house. So now, if the buyer doesn't pay, however, usually the seller can get the property back quicker in a land contract than they can in a wrap or a deed of trust. That is not as always the case, but when you get familiar that there are these 3 types of agreements, your biggest concern is if you want to sell with owner financing, which we're going to get to tomorrow. You should know which one of these that you want. Well, your attorney will know anyway, and the answer is very simple. Which one of these will get the property back quicker and applies in my state? So those are the tools for buying and selling with owner financing.